A very good afternoon to one and all present here. It's a privilege and honor to have Dr. Kingshuk Chatterjee with us to deliver a special lecture on the topic An Interdisciplinary Approach to Globalization and Indian Economy. Kingshuk Chatterjee is a professor of history and is associated with Institute of Foreign Policy Studies, University of Calcutta. Previously, he has been a founding member at uh, the Department of History in the department at Shiv Nadar University, and he was a visiting fellow at Maulana Abul Kalam Azad Institute for Asian Studies. He has been a Fulbright Scholar in Residence at the Naval Academy, United States in Annapolis, Maryland. He has been associated with the University of Dagon, Myanmar, University of Uppsala, Sweden, and King's College London, where he has been involved in collaborative research and he has even taught there. His recent initiative includes establishment of Center for Global Studies, Calcutta, which is a non-profit making independent organization that specializes in the area of interdisciplinary research in the area of global concern, which includes global politics, trade and commerce, soft power projections, and sustainable development. So children, if you follow world politics and if you're interested in current affairs and what is happening around you in this world, then you have the right person here today with you to whom you can direct all your questions to. And sir, I think will be more than happy to answer all of them. Sir, we welcome you to the MCKV family and I hand over this session to you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, Iram. My thanks to the MCKV for having me and giving me a platform and a kind of audience that I do not have the opportunity of interacting with much. It is only when you have grown up a lot more and know a lot more that I deal with you. So as it were, I'm now playing with clay that I usually find in a molded form. When Irma came forth with the option of talking to you on a subject that I had taught her and then forgotten all about after that, I thought, well, might as well brush it up and see what you people are thinking about it, because this is something that affects all our lives, perhaps more today than it did when this phenomenon began. The gradual integration of the Indian economy into the global economy, and as India becomes a part of the phenomenon of globalization. So when I was teaching Iram this, it was for an entirely different context and in an entirely different context. And as a historian, I'm afraid I stick to contexts. What I thought I would do, and what in fact Iram suggested that I should do with you, is speak to you the context in which this gradual integration began, because you have come into a world which is completely different from ours, which is so different from the world we grew up in. For instance, when I was your age, the world looked very different. One thing, if Corona happened then, and because the world was different, Corona couldn't have happened then. But if it had happened then I wouldn't have had the benefit that you have of listening to a webinar, because it would have simply shut us down and there were no smartphones, no mobile phones. That is, in fact, the most visible change that I can immediately think of. I remember a time when in the 1980s, in order to make an STD call, you had to book a trunk call. You would sort of book it in the morning, and then maybe you will get it in the evening, and there was no guarantee that you would. Communication was that difficult. Today, your phones are so smart that you don't book a call, you just make it. And sometimes your phone becomes your classroom. If you have a computer, so much the better. We did not even know of a computer when we were in school. When I, in fact, entered university, we had a strange kind of computer called a Busy Bee computer, In fact, I don't even know whether you know what a floppy disk today is. So we used to have computers which did not have hard drives. We used to insert a floppy disk and then a backup one so that we could save the documents, because the computer in itself had no storage facilities of its own. There are many other ways of talking about the effect of computers, effect of globalization in our lives. For instance, from the audience that I can see on the screen, I am assuming almost all of you, if not actually all of you, would have seen the Harry Potter films. Today, for me, Harry Potter films are the best examples of what happens in a globalized world, because the Harry Potter story, as you know, is set in England. It was written by an English author. All the actors and actresses, they're mostly English, but the director is American. The film is made in Hollywood, which means it's made in America for most parts, but the capital is coming, the money required in the making of the film is coming from Europe, Asia, Middle East, Russia, wherever, the world over. The camera with which the Harry Potter films were shot were in all possibility made in China, and they were processed on equipments made in China and Southeast Asia. But all the costumes that the wizard at Hogwarts used were made in Himachal Pradesh in India. And of course, as you know, the film was viewed all over the world. Now, if a Harry Potter film was to be made in the 1980s, it would have been probably made with a very low budget in the United States itself, with equipment limited to the United States, and maybe the movie wouldn't have been as colorful as it is, or as cheap as it is, as it would have been if it was made only in the United States. There are lots and lots of other examples that one can give you about globalization and its effects. But the most important thing that I think all of you would know by now is that globalization was made possible by a massive change in technology, in the technology that is used in industrial economies around the world. And its most visible impact, as I said, it is in the realm of telecom. Now, as a result of this telecom revolution and the digital technology on which that telecom revolution is based, it is now possible to break up the production of a commodity from one location. Earlier, we used to have factories, one factory in which a commodity would be made. Now the thing is spread over factories located at different places in a country. Sometimes you will find the same commodity being made in different parts of the world using different labor, but same technology. And sometimes you would find the various component parts of a commodity being made in different parts of the world and then assembled together in one particular place. So the world that we inhabit today is definitely much more closely integrated, where what is called a supply chain or a production chain has emerged, where different countries are now functioning as workplaces rather than different work sheds or different workshops. This integration of economies from all over the world as also both the production places, the factories, as also the markets. So both the raw materials and the actual production is distributed all over the world, and the commodity is also consumed all over the world. So export and import have far fewer restrictions today than it did in the world before globalization. This integration from economies all over the world is what we call, as you know, globalization. And India today is an important player. India would like to think it is a very important player. We're probably not that important yet, but we are an important player now in this process of integration of the global economy. Now, different disciplines approach this question of globalization differently. The discipline of economics, for instance, studies the mechanics of globalization. How did globalization actually come about? What did it involve? So movement of capital from A to B, movement of commodities from B to C, movement of labor from C to D, whatever. The discipline of commerce, which some of you are studying, basically looks at the commodity basket that is being traded and the volume that it is being traded. So how much goods are being moved by Amazon from one country to another? What commodities of goods are these? And these are questions probably you are dealing with anyway. History deals with a different kind of question. And that is the discipline I am approaching this question from. It basically comes up with a question that why what happened at the time it did. In other words, India's gradual integration into this globalized production system and this globalized marketplace takes place only from the 1990s, beginning specifically, you might actually say from 1991. And the historian deals with the context in which this actual integration happens rather than any other question. So why it happened, let's say in 1991 and not in 1985 or in 2005. And if the globalization that began in 1991 was contextually not determined, then why is it that this entire process has slowed down somewhat, has gone off cue somewhat? There are these various questions that a historian deals with. So to start with the question, why did the liberalization of Indian economy begin in the 1990s? You know, governments tend to be the living embodiment of Newton's first law of motion. And I'm assuming you know, or at least remember your Newton's, your basic physics and Newton's first law of motion. What does it say? It says, all bodies tend to be in their relative state of rest or motion, unless compelled by some external impressed force to act otherwise. The Indian government began to tread the path of liberalization and this gradual integration of global economy only when it faced with a crisis. Without a crisis, governments do not change. Economic reforms, the regime of economic changes that started with 1990s, begins with a serious economic and financial crisis that you may know had gripped India in the late 1980s, and it sort of ballooned out of all proportions by 1991. Now, the crisis that came in, the narrative today is very much different. Having lived through that time, we know what the crises were from a different context altogether. We know that the crisis of the 1980s was brought about by a series of very poor economic policies. You know, we had what we called the license Raj. So you want to trade in something, you want to set up a business, you need to be licensed to do that. So you have to declare to the government what are your assets, what is it that you propose to do, where are you going to get your capital from, and then the government would decide whether you are good enough to start the business. There were many areas where the economy was totally controlled. Okay, the government controlled what was called in the 1950s the commanding heights of the economy, the very heavy industries, iron and steel and stuff like that. And then gradually over a period of time, many other sectors began to be controlled entirely by the government. So one of these measures of control was only recently undone in the last month when the Indian Airlines was privatized. But there was a time when the Indian Airlines was actually run a private airline, run by the Tatas, before they were nationalized. So over a period of time, this nationalization that happens, it began to control production. And India had, for some sectors, especially those which were dependent on imported economies, imported commodities raw materials and machine components and stuff like that. For those, the sectors were almost totally controlled. So no airline was allowed to operate apart from Indian Airlines, because airlines requires, as you know, a specific type of fuel, which is very expensive. If you own an automobile company in pre-1990 India, then you have to deal with the fact that your engines have to be imported. So you need licensing from the government. You need regulation by the government, because the government would tell you how many scooters were LML Vespa to manufacture this year and how many scooters was Bajaj to manufacture that year. Almost everything was neatly controlled, well, not very neatly, but definitely rigidly controlled by the government. This was in order to reduce our import bills. Another attempt at reducing import bills was made through the policy of import substitution. So India wanted to manufacture as many things as it possibly could, so that it did not have to import too many things, because India was very low with foreign exchange. Our currency was very heavily regulated. And all of these things, you need to understand, are connected. As a result, if you are in the export trade, then you are in a very small niche. Not many people were given export licenses. And if you are in the import business, and if you are doing quite a lot of money in the import business, you are smuggling anyway, because very few people would be given the authorization to import. Licensing the import business was a very lucrative thing for government bureaucrats who were corrupt. But so far as the government was concerned, it was a very important way of restricting imports and therefore draining of foreign exchange. And now, in order to make sure that you have this import substitution made possible, the government used to run public service units, public service undertakings, which basically means that there would be some economic activities which over time grew in number and scale that the government would do by itself. So the government becomes a major player in the economy. And what happens is, when you are in the government, you don't have to bother about profit. If you are making a loss, government would pay it through the taxpayers' money. As a consequence, a lot of employment was generated, which need not have been generated. The government undertakings became loss-making institutions. So over a period of time, the government was borrowing heavily. This results in inefficiencies. So India was buying more from foreign countries than India was able to sell, which results in trade deficit. Plus, remember, India was always buying oil from the market, petroleum and diesel, and all of these things. We needed to buy the crude and then refine it. So that took a lot of money anyway, which we call the oil pool deficit, meaning the cost at which we purchase the crude and then refine it, and then we sell it at a much cheaper cost. So the government was not recovering the money by selling the product. So the government was continuously increasing its debt burden. So the government was making, or it was spending more than it was earning, which is what we call a fiscal deficit, as those of you who are studying commerce would know. And over a period of time, that meant if you keep on spending more than you are earning, then in order to balance your books, you need to borrow. So government's debt burden had kept on increasing. The crisis unfolded rapidly in the mid-1980s, or let's say that the crisis hit home in the mid-1980s, when India's most important trading partner, the Soviet Union, began to go through a period of economic slowdown and then gradually a meltdown. The Soviet Union, as you know, dissolved itself in 1991 as the Cold War came to an end. That is a story that there's no point in getting into it here. And the Soviet Union was India's most important supplier of imported technology. So now we were required to buy imported technology. We were required to import our technology from other countries, which were always more expensive places to buy those technologies from, precisely at a time when our earning was also beginning to, our forex earning was also beginning to take a hit because Soviet Union was buying less from us. Whatever arrangement we had, rupee ruble trade, so we would purchase things from the Soviet Union, but we would not pay them in dollars or rubles. We would pay them through equivalent amount of Indian currencies that would be available, and they would be buying the stuff from India and taking it away. So it was essentially a exchange in kind, a book transaction, rather than an actual foreign exchange transaction. Now, in 1989, the Soviet Union virtually collapsed. It went through a period of slow death between 1989 and 91. And then oil prices began to rise because Iraq occupied Kuwait and the Gulf War broke out in early 1991. All sorts of things. It was a global problem, in the midst of which India was faced with high oil prices, depreciation of the exchange value of the rupee because India's purchasing power was badly impaired once the Soviet Union was out of the picture. And the government of India's fiscal deficit, it rose to 12%, 12.7% of the GDP. That is to say, for every 100 rupees worth of value that India was generating, almost 12% was being subsidized by the government of India. Government of India was borrowing more than it was spending. The deficit financing at one point of time in 1991 came as high as 53%, which means for every 100 rupees that the government of India was spending, 53 went in paying off old debts. Because of the inefficiencies, because of the fact that government-run enterprises were no longer making profit, the government of India had to subsidize all industrial activity, almost all industrial activities. And in order to pay their salaries, they had to borrow. And then by 1991, we were paying off old debts to the tune of 53 rupees for every 100 rupees that the government was spending. This was an unsustainable situation. And it is only in this situation that India was suddenly faced with the requirement of paying its overseas and domestic debt with only 2 weeks of foreign exchange left, 3 weeks of foreign exchange that was left. In July 1991, India was looking at, the government of India was looking at the possibility that it would not actually be able to pay its debt because the government of India was simply borrowing money to repay an earlier loan. So government was basically borrowing from Peter in order to pay Paul, or borrowing from Ram in order to pay Rahim, whichever way you look at it. As a consequence of this, in June 1991, the government of India had to pledge, had to hypothecate India's entire gold reserve, which was in excess of 67 tons of gold, had to be pledged to the British bank and a Swiss bank in order to borrow further money from the IMF and avert a debt crisis. And IMF at that point of time was willing to pay the government of India the money it needed to overcome this crisis, only if there were to be structural adjustments. This, in IMF parlance, was called the Structural Adjustment Program. What did it involve? Well, I remember from those days there was this phrase, it involved 3 Ds. The Indian economy had to be de-licensed, de-controlled, and deregulated. So the government, you did not need to knock for in order to set up any business that you want. Anyone can do what they want. That was the ideal. Decontrol, the government would step back from those sectors of the economy where it was heavily involved, and deregulated. The government would not interfere with market forces. These measures were the first of a generation of economic reforms begun by Manmohan Singh as the finance minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh as the finance minister during the prime ministerial tenure of PV Narasimha Rao, as you probably know. But once
Sorry to
those,
interrupt, sir. I just
yeah,
wanted to
yes,
just strike a conversation over here. Like
yes.
back then, we needed globalization. We were pushed to the wall, and we had to adopt it.
No, no,
What
no,
do you
no, no, no. This is not globalization. This is merely opening up.
opening up of the economy? So
Globalization is what follows.
what follows? Yes, absolutely. So then now, given the current situation and we being affected with the we being affected with COVID-19, do you think we should curb this opening up a little? I mean, now that we are living in a globalized world where everything is so interconnected but yet not connected. So how do we go about with this?
No, that's what I was trying to get into. You see, with these 3 Ds that happened, delicensing, decontrol, and deregulation, the entire all these sectors of Indian economy were meant to be opened up. But this was meant to be done only gradually. The problem was that the Indian economy was sheltered from external forces for such a long time that much of the Indian economy was not in a position to compete with the globe. So Indian agriculture was heavily subsidized for such a long period of time that it had become accustomed to inefficiencies. In several sectors of Indian industry continue to demand protection because they need it, they genuinely need it. If you open it to market forces, a lot of Indian industry would simply shut down. There are areas of strength which India has, and there India has actually prospered. So software is a sector where India has done really good. But if you see higher education, forget school education, even higher education would not be opened up, because if you open it up, that sector, then India will not be able to compete in many ways. If you open up the health sector, India would not be able to compete in many ways, because the world has moved on continuously with its technology. It's just that we have not always been updating our technological levels. That's one. The other is that the social welfare mechanism, which needs to be strong in a capitalist economy to survive, ours is not that strong by any definition. So if you look at something like corona pandemic, it is confined only essentially to the urban areas of India.
True.
And even then, we are sort of struggling to cope with it.
Cope up with it.
How many good public sector hospitals do we have in the rural areas? Hardly any. So why do you think the agrarian communities would welcome globalization? They stand to suffer. So it is a matter of negotiation that happens. I'm merely saying that the liberalization began as a process following from a financial crisis, and that crisis has now receded, and the governments are now too busy keeping themselves safe from the wrath of the electorate, and therefore reforms have not really been carried through. And whatever infrastructure was required in order to bolster that regime of reforms have not been carried through. So we sort of scratch the surface by going with a rural employment guarantee scheme, the Manrega. Why do you need the Manrega? We go with Kanyasri. Girls going to school will be given bicycle as an incentive. Why would you need an incentive in order to go to school? And why should a bicycle be provided? It's because the agrarian economy is so poor that they cannot even get themselves to move from one point A to point B. And rural transport is a joke. So Indian economy has globalized only at the top level, at the upper echelons. And the lower echelons, the reforms have not percolated. And that is the reason why you have a backlash from below. Does that answer the question?
Yes, sir. Absolutely, it does.
Okay,
Actually,
I think there are actually going to be other questions, so I can sort
yes,
of
sir. Can we
blend
just open the
whatever.
session
Yeah,
for
please
Q&A?
open it up.
Yes.
Sure,
So,
sure.
yes. Children, if you want to know anything, I mean, I'm sure after such an enriching uh, lecture, you must be having a lot of things coming up in your mind. So please, I want all of y'all to just interact with sir, get your questions answered, and remember, we must learn to unlearn, and we must agree to disagree. And with this note, I'll just take up the first question for the day, sir. Yes, Ayush. Yes, Ayush.
Good afternoon, teachers and sir present out here in the seminar. So I wanted to ask a question. So like India and China are the two fastest growing economies of Asia, but sir, India is way behind China in economic development. Sir, what role did globalization have in this?
Um, globalization, well, let's put it this way. Globalization is a process of the integration, as I said, of global economic activities. Now, if you look at it that way, it had probably, you can say, it began long back with the whole world moving to similar technological platforms, industrialization happening. The sooner you integrate with that, the better. China began the integration of its economy with the world economy in the early 1980s, which is when it faced its crisis. And when China entered this process of integration, they integrated much more deeply in a much more systematic manner, comprehensive manner than India did. That's one. Second, unlike India, China never came under foreign rule. So in China, foreign technology did not have to be sort of brought suo motu from 1947. China kept on acquiring foreign technology as and when it was available. So let's say the process that India began in 1947, China began in 1911. So China had about 80 years of the advantage of an early start. The other thing that made a very crucial difference, India had always had to buy its oil requirements, meet its oil requirements from the Middle East and other parts of the world, but primarily Middle East. You know, when China began to import its petrol, oil and gas from the Middle East, only in the mid 1980s. So India was paying in Forex to pay this huge oil bill right from after India's economic independence, after political independence. China had begun only after it had begun globalization, because China had huge energy reserves of its own. So it had the advantage of early start. It had a higher technological platform to start from, and it had a lower sort of set of demands on its foreign exchange reserves than India did. So India was handicapped in three major ways. And that is the reason why China is leagues ahead. We are the two fastest growing economies, yes, but China is growing much faster than we are. And our growth is limited only in a small sector. In China, the growth is slightly broadly distributed across social sectors. So if you compare the strength of the two economies, China is much stronger than we are. If that answers your question.
Ayush, I hope it does answer your question.
Yes, ma'am. Yes,
right?
ma'am.
Yes. So
Thank you,
let's
sir.
take up another question. Okay, Naman, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Good afternoon, sir. I would like to ask one question, that how can Indian economy survive for so long even when India's imports have always been greater than the exports? I mean, they should actually decrease the forex reserves over the years, yet they are increasing drastically over a few weeks.
They did. Actually, you see, if you have, which class are you, Naman? 11. Yeah. So you, do you have a broad idea, broad familiarity with the history of Indian planning?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So As you know, the first plan was oriented towards agriculture. The second plan onwards, we were working towards industry. Now, after the third in a 5-year plan, we had 3 years of plan holiday. Do you know why? That is because at this time, the oil prices shot up 4 times, which means our oil bill increased 4-fold. And we needed actually to have a plan holiday in order just to make sure that all the trains were running and all the trucks were running. Those are the 2 things that physically integrate India, the railways and the roadways. So over a period of time, the rise in oil prices has very badly impaired India's foreign exchange reserves. And you see, unfortunately, because our industry was beginning from a position of disadvantage, our principal exports tended to be either agricultural or sort of, traditional exports mean gems and stuff like that, not industrial commodities, which means that either it's a high volume but low value commodities or high value but very low volume. And it was so low volume that it could not generate enough foreign exchange earning, which is the reason why India always needed to borrow externally as well as internally. So Indian government was borrowing money from you and me when we were buying our NSCs and KVPs, when we were investing in the banks, when in the post offices. And the Indian government was also borrowing from the global market, from IMF, from World Bank. But India was wary of doing that. India was trying to keep its foreign debt low. And in a situation we were not exporting too much, we were accumulating the debt gradually. And we were trying to reduce that level of debt by going the path of import substitution. The problem with import substitution is you can't manufacture everything, even if you import a lot of technology and then substitute production, because our industrial base was not strong enough. The technological base was not strong enough. So we were going, instead of sort of a rapid blood loss, what we had was a gradual hemorrhage. We just managed to survive because of trade arrangements which we arrived at with trading partners like the USSR. If we had to buy from the market the way Pakistan, for instance, had to do, India would have been still greater in debt, as Pakistan now is. So India and Pakistan are very good examples of 2 opposite strategies. Pakistan went the path of global borrowing from the global market, and Pakistan's economy has never really taken off. India tried to develop its economic infrastructure over a period of 40 years. So even in spite of this slow hemorrhage, we managed to develop enough industrial capacity. The crisis could have come earlier. It would have come sooner had we not come so close to the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union was not willing to help us out. If we were going to go into the open market, the crisis we had in the 90s, we probably would have had it in the 70s.
Sir, I think they have a lot of questions, and I can see too many hands raised. They're curious, I guess.
Let's try them. Let's try them.
Yes. Mayank Agarwal, 11D, if you could kindly unmute yourself and ask your question.
Good afternoon, sir, and good afternoon all the teachers present in this webinar. Sir, my question is like, after globalization, sir, many special economic zones are set up in India. Sir, many MNCs are entering on those areas only. So, sir, will it not affect some other areas which are not under special economic zones? And how would the government tackle this situation?
See, special economic zones were meant essentially to insulate foreign ventures in certain geographical areas and not allow them a free run all over India. As I said, because of the difference in our technological levels, open competition would mean ruination of Indian industry. That is the reason why SEZs were there. But SEZs were also meant to be a temporary measure. Because of the economic repercussions of the entry of foreign MNCs, there has been a lot of political blowback from Indian industries which do not want the SEZs to gradually open up and embrace a larger market. That is the reason why they are almost frozen in time. Elsewhere in the world, wherever you had SEZs tended to be phased out. They are not, they were never meant to be a long-term device of economic penetration or engagement. It is simply because of the economic weakness of the Indian setup as a whole and the political blowback that follows from it, that in India's case, SEZs are going on for unsustainably long periods, and they are not able to address the broader catchment areas that they were meant to cater to. Answer your
Okay, sir.
question?
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mayank. Children, I think we are running short of time, so we'll very quickly take last two questions and then sir can just answer them together. And I had seen Principal Sir Madhustali Vidyapeeth raising his hand. Sir, sorry, I couldn't unmute you then. If you could kindly raise your hand, I'll just unmute you, sir. Okay. Before that, let me just ask Siddharth Dugar. Siddharth, you can just unmute yourself and ask your question. Siddharth. And
Yes, sir.
Patwari. Okay. Yug Patwari and Siddharth Dugar. Kindly unmute yourself and ask the questions.
Good afternoon, teachers. And so my question is that as we are heading towards globalization, as Indian economy has diverted towards globalization, and as many other countries have done, so this has led to takeover of domestic economies, domestic production centers. So how can a country control it and even proceed with the globalization method? What is an alternative method for that?
You know, this is a thing. This is the whole debate in government. There are those who advocate liberalization and globalization. They would say the government is not meant to control this, that the economy should be left to the free hand, the invisible hand of the market. But if you do that, then you are left with the repercussions of it. So if Indian industry, for instance, slows down in the face of global competition, who would employ you? So it is a balancing that is required, that you must have economic growth, but it must not be at the cost of development. Now, you should be investing in developmental expenditure so that the human resources, material, other natural resources of India would be enough to keep the Indian economy standing on its own 2 feet and not be wiped away by foreign competition. Now, if you are fearing foreign competition, it shows inefficiency. So the government needs to sort of prepare the base in such a way that you will not fear foreign competition. India was dependent on the British for a long time, colonial rule for 200 years, and we blame everything on the British. Now, of course, we blame everything on Nehru. But you need to understand that with the development always come incrementally. You must invest at the right times in the right areas. What the right areas would have to be open to sort of contextual negotiation. So if education needs more investment and no private capital is coming there, invest in education. If health needs more investment, government is unable to invest, allow private capital to go in. There is no one size that fits all. It will depend on the nature of the problem that emerges from time to time. For instance, this agrarian question that we now are faced with. Should agrarian subsidies go? Yes, they should. But do you want cheap food or do you want more expensive food? You would want cheap food. You would want your cauliflowers in the winter to be available to you for 10 rupees. The government would not subsidize. So what would the peasant eat? In order to make sure that Indian agriculture survives, then you should be willing to pay a little more. Now, you would want the best of all worlds as a consumer, and then we would rule that we are unable to face competition. It is not a very simple solution. It is not that the government could solve the question and doesn't. It is just that the government is also grappling with these questions as much as we are. And we are making slow and incremental progress. All right.
Thank you, sir.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good
Um,
afternoon.
Sir, my question was now that India has launched its Make in India program, the Atmanirbhar Yojana. So, sir, are these plans complementing globalization or are they standing towards globalization? So, will it hamper India's rate of globalization or how it moves with the world?
See, the packaging is changing. Atmanirbharta, what is being proposed as Atmanirbhar Bharat, is exactly what India was aiming at when India was looking at import substitution. That is to say, if you need a smartphone, you should be able to manufacture it in India. Why do you have to buy a phone made in China or a phone made in Sweden or Finland? You should be able to manufacture it yourself. So whatever support is required for that, the governments need to provide. This is called creating the level playing field. Now, you cannot have completely free market. No country in the world, not even the United States, gives you a complete free access. Trade negotiations happen simply in order to regulate the access. Globalization simply asks you to minimize that level of negotiation and dependency on that negotiation. So Atmanirbharta is not sort of inimical to the idea of globalization. It is merely an attempt to create a kind of security net for the industrial lobby that we have in India that promote buying local over buying global. Why not? But the local commodities should be as good as the global commodities. That should also be ensured. That is where the free hand of the market comes.
Absolutely, sir. Actually, this reminds me of the concept of comparative advantage in economics, children. You
My
should
first
have the
conversation with
yes, sir. Comparative advantage is important, right? It's what is the
Yes.
if I am selling a particular commodity to you, which has equal quality, which is of equal standard, and I'm charging a higher price for commodity one and a lower one for commodity two, you would naturally buy the one which is cheap, isn't it?
Of
So
course, of course.
Atmanirbhar is not always the answer. It's you have to be interdependent. Interdependence is the answer for getting an Atmanirbhar Bharat, so to say. Well, we had a very delightful session, sir. I can see they still have their hands raised. I'm sure
Why
if
don't we
we can
take two more? I have no problem. Take two more.
okay,
Questions
we'll
could always be
I
entertaining.
so we'll take the last question for the day.
Okay.
I won't keep you waiting. I won't keep you waiting. Hitesh, go ahead and ask your question very quickly.
So, sir, like as you were talking about the recent developments and globalization, so, sir, what are your views regarding the Central Vista project? And, sir, like, is it necessary during this pandemic? And, sir, what global benefits will it provide to our country?
Global benefits? None. Do we need the Central Vista? Well, it depends on what whoever thought of the Central Vista. Why was it thought about? We really don't know, because governments do not give you information if you need them. Governments give you information if it needs your votes, not otherwise. So we don't know why the Central Vista project was at all launched. But there would be arguments saying that at a time when the economy has slowed down, the Central Vista project creates jobs. It creates demands for cement and a lot of other peripheral activities. It generates demand for casual labor. So you could have built roads, you could have built railways, you could have built hospitals, or you could build, or you could sort of reshape the capital and put your own stamp on it. Now, how would it help the economy survive through a sort of very difficult period? It would affect only the economy of Delhi and those who are supplying the various things that are required for the Central Vista project. It does not even have an all India repercussion, and it certainly has absolutely nothing to do with India's performance in the global economy, because the benefits of it are going to be extremely limited, if there are any.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you. Thank you so much. It was really indeed, it was a pleasure to have you here today, sir. And as you see, our children are very curious. So I might bother you with another session sometime soon.
I would love to. And in fact, it would be better because of the nature, because what you asked me to speak about and what then the questions were there on completely different things. We might as well actually have an entire session for question answers. I would love to address all their questions on globalization.
Sure, sir. Sure, sir. Now, I would
Right.
request Mrs. Madhumita Bhaumik to kindly propose the vote of thanks. Thank you.
Thank you, Iram ma'am. I would like to thank Dr. Chatterjee for taking out time from his busy schedule to enlighten our students. Thank you, sir, for sharing your thoughts with us. I would also like to thank our chairman, sir, Mr. Kishan Kejriwal, our director, sir, Mr. Neelkant Gupta, for giving us this opportunity for organizing this event. We would also like to thank our principal ma'am, Mrs. Malika Mukherjee, our headmaster, sir, Bishwajit Majumdar, sir, our HOD ma'am, Mrs. Ekta Gupta, our coordinators for their constant support and guidance to us. I would also like to thank the computer department for their help and support, without whose help we would not be able to conduct this program flawlessly. A big thank you to all my esteemed colleagues who could attend this seminar today. And last but not the least, thanks to all the students of Madhustali Vidyapeeth and MC Kejriwal Vidyapeeth for being such a wonderful audience. Thank you, everyone.
Now, with this, we conclude the session for the day. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.